right, we are going to head into our first speaker, and I'm so excited. I have to tell you that I met Rabbanit Shani Taragin several years ago, and her and I connected immediately. I love her so much. She has a heart of gold, and every time she speaks, I get very, very excited. I had the pleasure of actually going to Matan, where it's one of the places where she teaches, to hear her speak physically in person. And she's just an incredible person. She's an educational director of Matan Eshkolot, a Tanakh Teachers Education Program, and of the Morot al-Halacha program in Matan Renana. And Rabbanit Taragin serves on the advisory committee for the Mizrahi Olami Shalhevet program for Shalichim and lectures throughout Israel and North America on topics of Tanakh, Jewish education, and Jewish law. She's also a senior lecturer in Matan and is the curriculum coordinator for the Matan B'nai Akiva programs, MTVA. In addition, Shani is a Ramit Tanakh in Midreshet Lindenbaum and teaches at Migdal Oz, the women's Beit Midrash of Efrat and Gush Etzion, and in Matan Ramat Shiloah. Together with her husband, Reuven, she serves as Rosh Beit Midrash for the Beit Midrash program in Machane Moshava, Pennsylvania during the summer, and as educational director of Mizrahi Olami. It is with my pleasure to be introducing Shani Taragin, Rabbanit Shani Taragin.
Toda rabba. Kodem kol, firstly to Orly and to everyone here. What a beautiful initiative, both to engage in Sefer Tehillim through the Abraham's Legacy app, and certainly to engage in Torot on Erev Pesach, and not just these days before Pesach, but particularly tonight, Yud Nisan, the day that we know Am Yisrael took their Sel Leveit Avot, Sel Labayit, expressed their tremendous devotion, dedication to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, separated themselves from the culture of Egypt on this very day, and therefore very appropriate that we engage together as a tzibur, as a nation, engaged in our learning, preparing not just for the night of the Seder, but what we're going to engage in now. And I'm sure that Orly and Naomi and all the phenomenal organizers of this evening's event understood the significance of Netilat Yadayim, particularly on the night of the Seder. And what we're going to engage in is not only the halachot, but actually the basis for this, as we're going to see and examine together right now, how through Netilat Yadayim in particular, what we really basically have an opportunity to do on Leil HaSeder is literally relive Pesach in the Mikdash. Some of you may be familiar with a night in the museum or a night somewhere else. Well, the night of the Seder is basically a night in the Mikdash. And therefore, after the shiur this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are, I hope that we'll all enter a slightly different mindset this Leil Shabbat, this Leil HaSeder, Tafshin Pei Bet. So without further ado, I'm going to share the screen, if I may. Okay, so let's take a look together at these Mikorot that basically, again, I don't even know if Orly had in mind that there were so many different ideas to speak about, particularly Netilat Yadayim, with regard to Karpas, Korech. We're going to connect it to Corona, and what I love to call then really Seder night in the Mikdash. How we enter into a mini Mikdash state. So albeit we know that part of the evening and the trajectory is the Rambam Laharot. Yet, we're going to see is that numerous halachot are actually incorporated in order to make sure that we don't just live or relive or recount the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but actually how Yetziat Mitzrayim was recounted in the Mikdash. And the question is going to be why. So let's just get a very quick background as to washing our hands. And washing our hands, as we know, not just for motzi matzah, not just for eating the bread of the matzah, the lechem oni, but the Netilat Yadayim comes out on the night of the Seder. As we'll see, one of the bases for children asking questions, what are we doing washing our hands without a bracha? And all we're doing basically is eating a vegetable. So where did this idea come from? So let's take a look together at the Tosefta Mesachah Brachot. Notice that this is with regard to all of the halachot of brachot, not just the night of the Seder, The question is, how does one generally eat a meal? What's the order? Ketzad seder seuda. So the Gemara tells us, Orchin nechnasin v'yoshvim al safsalim. Guests enter, they sit on chairs, armchairs, until everyone is assembled. This was a formal way of eating, a dignified manner. When everyone was assembled, they're given water, and everybody washed their hands. And notice everybody washes one hand. Why is this? Then wine is mixed. Every guest says a bracha. Appetizers are set before them, and every guest then recites the bracha. Depends. Does he want a Moshe Bateva, a Franken blanket? Does he want some sushi? Whatever the case may be. Then they go, that was just the appetizers. Then they're going to go to the main meal, wherein they sit down, they lie down on their couches like a triaculum, and then they start the meal in a different room. And what's interesting is that the Gemara explains there, in kiddush ela b'makom su'uda, that the reason why you have wine is because they already are going to start their su'uda. But it's a strange thing. Everybody washes their hands. And it seems that, why does everyone wash their hands? The Gemara in Mitzvah of Pesach is going to relate to this and basically tells us that this was more or less a standard way that people would eat. They would wash their hands. To a certain degree, one can argue that it's like telling our children, wash your hands before dinner. You must have dirty hands, but we're going to see that it was more than that. The Gemara Mitzvah of Pesach, source number 3, Daf Kuf Yud Dalet, tells us that what happens on the night of the Seder? Well, we have people bring us vegetables before the leader of the Seder prior to the actual meal. And this is when, especially no other vegetables on the table, he dips the chazeret, which we're going to see is actually the maror, before he reaches the dessert of the bread. And then they bring him matzah, chazeret, charoset, and 2 cooked dishes in honor of the meal. Now, these cooked dishes were not necessarily part of the main meal. Rather, the Tana tells us that this is generally what they would do as basically an appetizer for the meal. So far, this fits in beautifully with what we've seen in Masechet Brachot. Now, the only part that we haven't seen is this idea of, again, matzah and chazeret and charoset. Chazeret, we know that's the maror. What's this charoset? Rabbi Eliezer ben Tzadok says it's actually a mitzvah to eat the charoset. It's not just as some type of intermezzo to get the bitter taste out. Rather, it's charoset. And not just that, then we have immediately thereafter, the Gemara then tells us, Uvemikdash hayu miviyin lefanav gufo shel Pesach. It's almost as if the Gemara wants to tell us very clearly that the whole point of the first few stages is to build up to the main meal, just as we have today. We have various appetizers. That's what they would do. They would bring in various vegetables, and the chazeret included, and then they would bring the matzah, and then they would bring the main dish, the centerpiece, the basis that we know upon which all of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim would be told. The Gemara then continues, and Reish Lakish says, wait a second, this is very confusing, because what's going to happen? In the same Gemara, we heard that first we are going to have vegetables. Again, vegetables are brought, and then, wait a second, we have more vegetables. We have the chazeret, we have the maror. So it must be, we see from here that mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, that mitzvot require intent, because at least I have to know that, in fact, when I'm going to be saying a borei pri hadama on some vegetables, that I have in mind the bitter herbs, that I have in mind the maror. And yet some say, no, maybe that means that they don't require a special kavanah. But no, of course, one has to have kavanah. Even when one is eating the first vegetable, you have to have kavanah for the maror. So as we all know, that's exactly what we do. And then the Gemara introduces something very interesting. Could it even enter your mind that mitzvot don't require kavanah, that they don't require intent? Wait a second. So then why do you need 2 dippings? If I already dipped my first vegetable, which here is understood as something like lettuce. Today, some people use a potato, as you know, or a radish or celery, but then it was a regular lettuce. And so why do I need 2 dippings? So the Gemara says, I still know that mitzvot really do require kavanah. The first opinion says the 2 dippings must be here to show me that I need, when I dip once, I already have to be thinking of the second dipping. Namely, it's not just that when I dip for my initial appetizer. So again, on the night of the Seder, we have appetizers before we get to the main meal. This seems to be the basis behind karpas. But it's not just that. The Gemara now tells us beyond just eating an appetizer vegetable, before you get to the main meal and before you even get to maror, you're going to say bori prihadama, and you're going to have in mind that it includes the vegetable of maror. In order to make sure that you know this, you're going to dip twice. But wait a second, and maybe I don't dip twice because I have to have in mind my dipping of the maror and the charoset. No, maybe I need two dippings for the basic reason on the night of the Seder that I do a lot of strange things. I bring my regular appetizers, I bring my regular potato, my celery, my lettuce, my radish, you fill in your karpas vegetable, and then I dip it, which in itself is strange. And then I'm going to dip another vegetable, i.e. the maror, the bitter herbs. I'm going to dip that separately to make sure that it's conspicuous for the children. Wait a second. What if the Tana then is telling us that, of course, on one hand, this is so that the children will ask questions, but it also is teaching that there's something special about the night of the Seder that we ask about even. Generally, people did dip their vegetables as we do today. We have our carrots and our cucumbers and we dip them in a dip. Then why on this night do we have it twice? If one only has chazeret, in other words, if I only have some of the regular, if I only have the maror, then shouldn't it be enough just to dip the maror in the charoset? Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that technically, if even if I just have maror, I still need two tevilot. I still have to dip twice. Why? To show that tonight is different. To show that this is a very special night. Dip twice. Make sure you take your vegetable. Ideally, one should be your regular vegetable, and one should be the vegetable that you have just for the night of the Seder, which is the maror in the charoset. The Gemara then says, okay, what food should I bring? And all different possibilities. This is where we get different beets or rice or whatever the case may be, whatever you want to bring for an appetizer. That's why, as you know, different minhagim for Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. But let's continue in the Gemara. What is it? Maybe it's a fish. Maybe it's an egg. Rav Yosef says, actually, you already know that you have two types of meat, one to remember the Karban Pesach, one to remember the Karban Chagiga. And this is fascinating because this seems to be the basis why many Ashkenazim as well place a beitzah. They place an egg on the Seder plate as well, Zecher LeKarban Chagiga. Some explain that it's because the night of the Seder parallels the night of Tisha B'Av, so to remember the Avelut as well. And interestingly, we do something that doesn't seem to really have a basis, and that is that we dip that also, and all different explanations that we're going to see why we also dip an egg. A lot of dippings going on. Now, you're all supposed to wonder, what does this have to do with Netilat Yadayim? So this is where we're finally going to see that what happens is that I say the bracha over my karpas, basically abori prihadama. I have in mind that it's also going to cover achilat maror. And then I have to also dip this and eat it. And Rav Chisda tells us I have to make sure as well. Again, when I say bori prihadama, even though there are different opinions what to do, everyone in the end, and this, as we know, is the halacha, I say bori priyadama. I try, however, to make sure that I have in mind maror as well, and try as well not to eat more than a kazayit. Okay, excellent. This explains why we have all the different types of dippings, why we have so many different vegetables. But now let's take a look and see, not only is this a special bracha, not only is there a special tivul, but it's even more than that. Again, the Sefer HaTruma, let's take a look, tells us that we have to be careful with this mitzvah, also not to get too full on this, but comes the Shulchan Aruch, and we're going to see where this idea comes from in just a moment. Notel yadav litzorach tvol rishon. The Shulchan Aruch tells us you have to wash your hands for that first tevilah. Now, at first glance, I'm thinking, this sounds like the Gemara in Brachot with which we began. You have to wash your hands because it's going to be eating something. So before I eat, basically my first food, I'm going to wash Yadayim, but explain to the Shulchan Aruch, v'lo yavarech al hanetilah. This isn't for the Seudah. This is just to make sure that you have a vegetable with that's going to be dipped. V'yikach mehakarpas pachot mikazayit. diet, as we said, to make sure that I don't get too full, that I'll also be able to eat my maror, and dip it in some type of vinegar or salt water, and knowing that there's more food to come, you don't say a bracha achrona. Now, why is this so significant? Let's take a look. And what we see is, wait a second, I wash. Well, that doesn't surprise me because it seems that they used to wash for their vegetable, but it seems to have something special about a vegetable that I'm dipping. And what's special about the night of the Seder? More dippings, more reason to ask children what's going on. But wait a second, I do a few strange things. For example, even as we know, when I'm going to dip my maror into the charoset, dipping number 2, we also see that we do something else. Not only do I dip it for the sake of maror, al mitzvah achilat maror midrabanan today, but I also do it again. I dip my maror again in charoset, and then I put it between literally a sandwich of matzah for the korech. And why do I do this? Again, I do it zecher lemikdash kehillel. I do this because Hillel, during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, explained that the proper way that one fulfills the mitzvah deoraita of al matzot u'morim yochluhu, that the proper way to eat my karban pesach is together with matzah and maror. Again, it doesn't mean one after the other, which is what we do also, but Hillel explained this is what we're supposed to do, korchan bevatachat. Again, put them all together as we do al matzot u'morim yochluhu. Make sure that they're all going to be wrapped together as a sandwich. And why do I do this? Let's take a look. Again, also without a bracha, this is zecher lemikdash kehillel, to remember not what we did, by the way, always in the mikdash, to remember what Hillel did in the mikdash. And this is where we see the basis of the Shulchan Aruch. This is the primary, I would say, the title of our shiur comes from this Gemara that once again is part really of a general Gemara explaining in Arvei Psachim, Kuf Tet Vav Amud Aleph, what we do the night of the Seder. That's not just different, but look carefully. Korech is mentioned first to teach us something that's done to bring us back to remembering not just the night that we left Mitzrayim, but to remember the temple service. And that's when we had Korech with the Karban Pesach, with the matzah, with the maror, and then comes Rabbi Elazar, and he quotes Rabbi Oshaya, who says, Kol shetibulo b'mashket tzarich netilat yadayim. Anything that's dipped in a liquid before it's eaten requires the washing of one's hands. Now, this is interesting because you'd expect that this statement of Rabbi Elazar should have been, and at the beginning of the parak, it should have told us this, that, well, you're going to be dipping. We already discussed the dippings. So tell us in the context of the dippings. But no, the Gemara is telling us this. Why? In order for us to remember, to learn the halacha, that it's not just about the dipping that makes the night special. It's not just the double dipping, pardon the terminology. Rather, the chidush of the night of the Seder is in the context of all different things that bring us back to the mikdash. What does that mean, bring us back to the mikdash? So the Gemara goes on to tell us that we have to, when we place, or anytime we dip, again, both with regard to dipping, definitely the karpas, but then the Gemara says, so why don't we have to wash again before the maror? And the Gemara says, actually, again, one shouldn't, because as soon as it seems that part of the reason as well is that there's some idea of the poison of the maror, but no, rather, what do we want to make sure of? That really maybe my hands became tamei again. And now we have an understanding here in Gemara Psachim of why we wash our hands. And this, as we know, is the basis, not only of why we wash our hands on the night of the Seder, but actually why we wash our hands for bread. So let's take a look. Again, and we see that it's important that we understand why we wash our hands. You wash your hands for the first dipping, and really Rav Chisda says, maybe I should wash my hands for the second dipping as well. The halacha in general is that one who generally dips food twice, then should dip one's hands. What is special then? On one hand, on the night of the Seder, I dip twice, which generally isn't done, because I have 2 dips of vegetables. So then why don't I wash my hand twice? And then the question is, wait, if you generally wash your hands twice, and not only do I not wash it now, but why do I generally do have to dip again? And the answer is, and why do I have to wash again? And we're going to see how the Gemara is going to conclude that you do have to wash, which is what we do for motzi matzah. So let's take a look. Where does this idea come from of washing the hands? And now we're going to understand, as we see this section, starting source number 13, why do we even wash? The Psukim and Sefer Shmot teach us that Aaron and his children, before performing any of the avodot, would have to always wash Yadayim v'ragleim. They always had to wash their hands from the kior, even if they just went to the mikvah. And we know this from Yom HaKippurim as well. Not only are there 5 tefillot, 5 times that the Kohen Gadol is going to immerse himself in a mikveh, but in addition, he's going to 10 times perform what's called taktashat yadayim v'raglayim. He washes his hands and basically 10 times. And not only does he have to wash, but we see that he and his children always have to wash their hands. The Mishnah Masechet Yadayim explains to us why this is the case. And the answer is that our hands always have a status of what's known as sheni latum'ah. They're always second degree tum'ah, which means that, again, that they can basically pass tum'ah over to others. And this is where, again, I get so excited because it's so clear that especially the past 2 years have gotten us used to what it's like to live in the mikdash. Again, there's so many aspects of corona, whether it's wearing a mask to make sure that our saliva doesn't spread tum'ah, not just germs, but the tum'ah of the mikdash. There's something called tumat rok, the tum'ah of the saliva. So to the hands. Remember how we were washing hands and we had to sing happy birthday to ourselves to make sure that we had enough of the disinfectant on our hands? Well, basically, and by the way, again, corona has definitely gotten us used to. I hope that the past parshiot of Tazria and Mitzora have helped us. And now we understand them so much more. Quarantine for 7 days and then Safek quarantine for another 7 days. We're all in a mikdash mindset right now. And sure enough, Gana Corona taught us as well this Mishnah in Masechet Yadayim, which is that the hands always contract tuma. Now, for most of us, that doesn't make a difference, even though Yadayim, that our hands are always so busy and they're always touching things that could be impure, and thereby we may spread that impurity. But ultimately, ochlin and mashkin, food and beverages, cannot contract third degree tum'ah unless they're trumot and kachim, unless they're brought in the mikdash, which is why a kohen always had to make sure before touching anything, and especially truma, he had to make sure that his hands were always tahor. So now I'm looking at some of you trying to figure out who are wives of Kohanim or daughters of Kohanim. Anyone over here? Okay, I'm sure there are some of you. And the reason this is significant is because let's say, I'm going to make this up right now. Again, let's say Razi Saperstein, again, is an Eshet Kohen. Are you? See, I had a feeling because that is a Kohen name. Thank you. Again, how do you like that? Razi Saperstein is a Kohen. So is actually Cheryl Horowitz. Are you also an Eshet Kohen? Okay, excellent. That fits. Even though Horowitz's are Levium sometimes, but Cheryl wants to have lunch in again with Razi. Little problem. Razi has truma at home because Lisa dropped off her hafrashat challah this morning, and therefore Razi has to make sure that when she eats her truma, when she prepares her truma, literally the challah that was given to her by Lisa, she has to make sure that her hands are tahorot. Not only that, this is very scary. Everyone ready for this? Gana, let's say Cheryl comes with her holy bagel. Oh, that's funny, holy and bagel. But let's say she comes with her holy bagel tuna to Razi's house. And once upon a time, Cheryl didn't have to wash for her holy bagel tuna sandwich, and for no reason. And she didn't have to wash, but Razi, again, may forget to wash. A Kohen who eats truma b'tuma is chayav mita, as we saw. Baital hem chokolam v'lo yamutu. So Chazal instituted that Cheryl should also wash her hands on the holy bagel, again, to make sure that Razi washes her hands, and especially when it comes to truma in the mikdash. And this way, Chazal established that for bread, one has to make sure that one's hands are always going to be tahor. Now, you should ask oneself, wait a second, the hands can also contract tuma anytime they're wet. And that's why we have to be careful to make sure that our hands are dry. We say the bracha before we dry our hands, because the last stage of the washing is really the drying, that they have to be dry. Because if my hands now touch, let's say I have wet hands and they touch this clementina right now, and this was clementina that I was going to give as truma to the kohen. So now my hands contracted, and I had tuma. Now this clementina has tuma, and now the kohen can't eat it and not anymore. I basically completely nullified it. So what a Kohen always had to do, not just with truma bread, but with truma fruits and truma vegetables, he had to make sure that his hands were always washed. Don't worry, we're going to have a separate area in the supermarket, or everyone's going to take gloves so that we don't have to contract tuma. Again, it's all going to be worked out beautifully. But now that we're so used to washing our hands, and Baruch Hashem to Corona for this, now we understand this Mishnah Masechet Yadayim. Kol haposel et truma mitamei et hayadayim liot shniot. So Chazal established that when it comes to bread, we're always going to wash our hands. How about the fruits and the vegetables? Kohanim in the time of the Mikdash were careful with that, but not anymore. Today, the Gemara established that we're only going to be careful about washing our hands with regard to bread, because that's much more common. And to sit down and eat bread with the kohen than to actually sit down and just have a clementina with a kohen. We also see, though, that one has to wash one's hands before dealing with dvarim shebekdusha as well. And the Rambam, just to see this even more, Maimonides tells us beautifully, what does one do then on the night of the Seder? He says, once upon a time, they would give everyone mozgin kos l'kol echad v'echad. This sounds like the Gemara and Brachot, but no, it's talking about the night of the Seder. And you would say Bori Pri Hagafen and Kiddush Hayom, and you would drink. V'achar kach mevarech al Netilat Yadayim v'notel yadav, u'mevi'in shulchan aruch v'alav maror v'yerek acher u'matzav v'charoset v'kufo shel keves haPesach. In the Mikdash, of course, they would have Netilat Yadayim with a bracha, and then they would bring the food, and then you would have all your dippings, and then they would bring the centerpiece together with the basar of the Chagiga. And the Hagot Maimoniot comments, and he says that was in the time of the Mikdash. What are we going to do the night of the Seder? We're going to reinstate what the Kohanim used to do in the Mikdash, not just for bread, but also for fruits and vegetables. And by the way, Rav Kuka was a Kohen who lived, as you know, with the excitement of Mashiach coming any moment. He actually did wash for all of his fruits and vegetables. And the night of the Seder, we all act as Kohanim. We all wash, but we wash without a bracha. In the time of the Mikdash, they would say a bracha for dipping, even for karpas, but today we don't. And this, the kachin ragil lasutan below bracha. The night of the Seder, we have an opportunity, as we see, and the Rambam actually codifies, that's what we're going to do. We're going to, on one hand, do all these interesting things. We're going to have our regular dipping, but we're also going to have an additional dipping. But you know what? We're going to not only say a bracha to have in mind dipping number 2 to keep our children curious the whole time, we're also going to do other things that will tell them that things are different tonight than all other nights. What's different tonight than all other nights? We incorporate Netilat Yadayim, like they did in the Mikdash. We're all going to act as Kohanim. And it's true, we're not. So we're going to say it below bracha, but we're going to remember Zechar LaMikdash. And take a look at so many things that we do, Zechar LaMikdash. We have Dea Korech, as we said, Zechar LaMikdash. And again, we go back to Hillel at the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And the Gemara tells us, Zechar LaMikdash ki Hillel. We're going to have a charoset. We're going to make sure that we remember the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And even though in the time of the Mikdash, they didn't even paskin like Hillel. Hillel sandwich reminds us of the idea of compromise. And I'd like to end, and I know that my time is up, and I'd like to end not only with the idea of the night of the Mikdash, and I have to share with you that every year we incorporate different means in our family of making the night of the Seder come to life, but every year, and we take off our shoes and we put on slippers to remember that we're, so to speak, going into the Mikdash without our leather shoes. And yes, it's true, I give everyone a little lamb stuffed animal to remember the Chag of Pesach. And yes, I give everyone a copper mirror to remember the copper mirrors of Mitzrayim, that the women were able to look back at the past and understand that not to get stuck in the present, but to look at the beautiful future and to look at a future of what it could be like to go back to the Mikdash, to live life in the Mikdash. And just as we know that every Shabbat we get a little taste, me'ein olam haba, every night of the Seder, my favorite night of the year, and it should be everyone's favorite night of the year, we go back to the Beit HaMikdash and we wash Netilat Yadayim. And throughout the entire year, when we wash Netilat Yadayim with a revi'at of water, knowing that we're getting rid of Tumat Yadayim, that hopefully we're going to re-engage as we all join together, and both with Shrincy and with Lisa and everyone coming together on the night of the Seder, with Cheryl and her holy bagel, that we're all going to bring our holy bagels and our holy matzot. And at the night of the Seder reminds us of the potential of what it's like then, not only to wash for bread, but what it's like to wash for anything dipped in water, anything dipped in one of the 7 liquids that contract tumah. And I want to end with an idea that Rav Brandeis brought up literally at the beginning of Corona 2 years ago. And he says, it's so interesting when we read all these parshiot, Avat Hazria Mitzora, of what life was like in the Mikdash, we realize how Kohanim had to be so careful with regard to all different types of tuma. He says, "Ksha'anu manasim lidamien la'atzmenu olam shabo yesh tzumat lev, em lo lomar hakbada mele'a al kol seder taharot." He says that meant that in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, everyone was super duper careful, Kohanim in particular, about the world of taharot. He says it's hard to imagine how everyone did this. We're so nervous before Pesach about chametz. Again, that is an isur karet. How about tuma and tahara? Then we have a hard time, as it is, keeping chalavi, bisari, and parv. He says, think about this mitziut where anyone, you contracted tuma through death, nida, yoledet, zavim, shratzim, mecholalim tuma ha'overet bofanim shonim. Tuma spreads through all different means. Bein b'nei adam u'b'neihem lebein hasbiba. You have to be so careful of your surroundings. He says, you know what it is? Tahara brought you to a state of mindfulness of your body, mindfulness of your surroundings, mindfulness of your state, mindfulness of who you're eating with, mindfulness of what you're sitting on, what you're sleeping on, what type of kelim you're using, what type of bigadim. Is this something, my garment that's mekabel tuma or not? What am I eating? What types of liquids are here? Kedei ladat, in order to know whether or not it contracts tum'ah or whether it doesn't contract tum'ah. He says, think about this. That's what goes on the night of the Seder. On the night of the Seder, haroshim hu shechabra chaya b'olam shel taharot, when in the Mikdash, living in Mikdash world, living with tumah and tahara, living with sensitive Netilat Yadayim, meant that we were mindful of all of our surroundings. This is what definitely Corona brought us to be a little more sensitive to. He says, maybe that's exactly it, that Corona brought us to a state of learning anew what it's like to live with taharot, what it's like to live then, to go beyond just the material and to know that there are different germs in the atmosphere and different phenomena that we don't even see with our eyes. He says that's what the world of Kedusha is all about. And on the night of the Seder, as we enter the world of the Seder, we realize that it's not just the different objects that we see before us. It's much more than that. Netilat Yadayim on the night of the Seder is halacha's way of bringing us back to the Mikdash, bringing us back to a state of mindfulness, bringing us back to a recognition and a cognizance that there are powers that are beyond what we see before us. And even though we point to our children on the mitzvah of chinuch, and we point to the Pesach, and we point to the matzah, and we point to the maror, when they ask us, why are we washing Netilat Yadayim? We're going to tell them because there's a world of tumah and tahara that we aspire to go back to, that we aspire to return to, because it's a state wherein we're mindful of more than anything else of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our lives. Wishing you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and Be'ezrat Hashem, a little bit more mindfulness as we wash Netilat Yadayim every day of the year.
Wow, Rabbanit Shani Taragin, thank you so much for sharing this. There was so much information here. I'm sure we could go on for hours just talking about Netilat Yadayim. There's so much to do in terms of Pesach, but what I love the most is the concept of the Mikdash mindset. That's exactly what we are being prepared for an incredible time that's about to come upon us. and we have to get prepared for it. And that's an exciting thing. I want to thank you so much for sharing these words of encouragement and strength for us, as well as just learning so many new things as we're going to be going into Pesach, and we're all going to be doing that Netilat Yadayim. Hopefully we should keep those words in our mind and keep that mindfulness in our hearts, so that we could bring Kedusha to our hands, and therefore that Kedusha can be infused into everything else that we touch. Because like you said, everything that we touch comes from our hands. Every aspect of our life comes from our hands. So thank you so much, Rabbanit, for being here and for sharing with us. So grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for the split.
Thank you.